So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster and senior vice president of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The plan today is to walk you through some of our latest and greatest public opinion data, which should only take about 15 minutes, and then give you an opportunity to ask questions. Make sure to use the Q&A field in the GoToWebinar meeting application at any time to submit questions, and then Scott, Wendy, and I will try to the best of our ability to answer them based on all of the data, all of the research we've done over the past year and a half on the coronavirus pandemic. So starting off, where the country is right now, we are seeing a surge in cases over the last month and a half because of the Delta variant of the coronavirus. Delta has proven to be much more transmissible than the original version of the virus, and we're seeing pretty significant case numbers across the country, initially in the Southeast, but now increasingly sort of across the entire country. And this is despite the fact that a large majority of the country has actually gotten vaccinated. This is looking at the adult population, and this is slightly out of date. It's actually at about 73% of the 18 plus population has been vaccinated, but this particular outbreak right now with Delta is been characterized by being primarily in that quarter to third of Americans who are still unvaccinated. It's actually a larger population, and I'll show you that in a moment. But I think it's worth noting that the vaccination effort, which over the spring looked like it was going to be so promising that we were going to reach a level where the population was pretty inoculated, really stalled out in May and early May. And, from that point to now, we saw a very slow increase in vaccination rates, and the population that told us in our Axios Ipsos polling that they were steadfastly against being vaccinated stayed pretty consistent at about 20% of adults. In the last few weeks, it's dropped down to 15% as Delta has sort of surged, and we've seen a lot of people experiencing it firsthand, changing their opinion, but we're still seeing the vaccination effort somewhat slow. And I think the 70% vaccinated is maybe a little bit of illusion, because it's important to remember that the full population is not actually even eligible for the vaccine yet. This is, it's got some bells. Let me click through those real quick. This is actually what the population looks like. So on the left, you have the population in millions. So there's the adult 18 plus population in dark green and dark red. About 189, 190 million have gotten at least one shot. Another 69, 70 million adults have said no to the vaccine or haven't gotten it yet. Then there is the population of teens, 12 to 17-year-olds who are able to get the vaccine based on the emergency use provisions from the CDC and the FDA. But that group is only about half vaccinated right now, about 12 million vaccinated and 13 million unvaccinated. And then there's kids. Kids under the age of 12 are still not eligible for the vaccine, and that represents almost 50 million Americans. So when you take that together, there is still over 100 million Americans who are unvaccinated at this time, and that's where the Delta variant is really affecting most strongly. There are certainly reports of breakthrough cases, but the large majority of cases do appear to be among this unvaccinated population, which does remain actually somewhat large as a component of the full population, about 39% of the full population. So what has the American people done to adapt to this fourth, fifth, depending on how you count, wave of the pandemic? Well, it has been adapting, but I think one of the key things to note is we're not really seeing the wholesale changes we saw, certainly not last spring when the coronavirus first came out and the country screeched to a halt last March and April, or even as much as we saw over the winter holiday when the last big surge of the pandemic was happening. We're seeing a downtick of people reported out-of-home behavior from a high of going out to eat in sort of the mid-60s in the last week and visiting friends up to 70% among the vaccinated in late June, down about 10 or so percentage points, but it's still well above the point it was during the winter surge of coronavirus. So yes, we're seeing people pull back a little bit, but we're not seeing the wholesale isolation, the stay at home, the social distancing, the self-quarantining we saw last year. And we're seeing relatively symmetrical changes in behavior among both the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. The unvaccinated, like I said, are the population that's most at risk, but we're really seeing both groups kind of moving together. At the same time, mask usage has sort of started to tick back up after dropping off over the spring. And again, though, we're seeing that really a little bit more with the vaccinated population than the unvaccinated population. They had both sort of dropped over the spring. The vaccinated particularly dropped after the CDC announced in May that it was okay for the unvaccinated to go without masks. Since late June, and as the Delta variant has sort of taken hold, we've seen it bounce back up slightly, but again, nothing to the level that we saw last year. And I think these are important to keep in mind when we're thinking about the public response to this current pandemic. Is it's just not quite as pronounced as we saw in earlier waves and any of the sort of protective measures. And that I think is also potentially feeding into why the Delta variant is continuing to spread, but it also, I think, speaks to some of the commercial implications with people not necessarily taking the full step back that we saw. So let's look at these groups a little bit more in detail. And we're going to break up, this is adults, this is sort of excluding kids, but among adults, what do they look like? And we're breaking them up into three groups. There's the vaccinated, which represents a little over 2/3 of American adults. People who are on the fence, that is essentially they haven't gotten the vaccine, but they're potentially open to it. That represents about half of the unvaccinated population. And then the people who are a hard pass, that's sort of been my sort of colloquial term for the people who are just steadfastly rejecting getting the vaccine. When we look at them, there's some interesting patterns that emerge. People who are on the fence tend to be people more likely to be minority Americans, Black, Hispanic, tend to have lower household incomes, tend to have lower educational attainments, and tend to be a little bit younger. This is the quintessential group that is essentially either has access issues to getting the vaccine or has not really been fully convinced that it is an immediate need for them personally to get the shot. But they don't necessarily have the sort of philosophic or politically driven opposition that we see in the hard pass group, which is a group that is much wider, is more affluent, is somewhat more highly educated, is older. That is a group that is being motivated more by values, by politics. I've been telling people who ask that people who are in that hard pass camp are oftentimes sort of motivated more sort of by the culture war aspect of the vaccine and masking to that matter effort now. And it's less anything about the actual shot of the vaccine in and of itself and more about how that fits into the larger conflict in American society. And when we look at those sort of new rules or mandates, where is the country? Well, it's actually interesting because you see a lot of the coverage news coverage focusing on people being outraged about masks, being outraged about vaccine mandates, being outraged about that. But the majority of the country is actually, generally speaking, in favor of these sort of rules or mandates intended to get the coronavirus pandemic under control. This is from a recent Axios survey we did. 2/3 of the public believe that local school districts should require everyone to wear masks. 2/3 require think that it's okay for state or local governments to require masks. Just over half, 55%, think it's okay for employers to require vaccine mandates at the workplace. That's among working Americans. That's not all Americans. And then when we sort of flip it on its head and look at places where you've actually seen politicians make prohibitions against these preventative steps, we see that's pretty unpopular. Only a third of Americans support state laws prohibiting mask requirements, and fewer than a quarter support state laws that withhold funding from local governments that make mask requirements. This is, I think, particularly sort of in response to Arizona, Texas, and Florida, where the governors have made various sort of rules about local governments not being able to put masks into place. So we can see, generally speaking, and we see across a lot of other research we've done, broadly speaking, there is a pretty consistent majority in favor of preventative measures. There's a minority who's opposed to that. It's a very vocal minority, but it is a minority between 20 to 30% of the country, depending on the specific question you're asking. But most Americans aren't actually experiencing these rules or mandates that much in their daily lives. Half of working Americans say they work in a place that requires masks, but only 16% say that they work at a place where their employer requires vaccination at this point. Now, I think it's an open question if the FDA's authorization of the Pfizer vaccine yesterday changes that. We'll continue tracking it. But you know, there is, I think, a relatively clear difference between what people sort of are okay with or support and what they're actually experiencing. And then when we ask the public about sort of what they're willing to do during the sort of current surge of the pandemic, we see a big sort of change, particularly driven by partisanship about what people are willing to do. Now, this is asking, are you less likely to do the following? So you sort of need to flip the numbers on the head a little bit. But essentially, half of Americans say they're less likely to go to crowded places. Half say they're less likely to go dining out. Just under half say, you know, visiting city centers, visiting large cities on vacation, going to concerts. And we can see, again, consistently, Democrats are more likely to restrict that behavior, Republicans less likely to restrict that behavior. It's the biggest difference of any demographics we have in our research, showing sort of how much the pandemic continues to be sort of wrapped into the political culture wars of the moment. So what has been happening with the economy? Well, you know, this is from our Ipsos Consumer Confidence Index. We saw a pretty consistent climb in consumer sentiment through the spring as the vaccination effort was coming out. And it really sort of plateaued in late spring, sort of late April, early May, right as essentially the vaccine effort also hit that sort of plateauing part, and really started to be bouncing up and down. I think inflation has also been a factor that's sort of been a little bit of a drag on consumer sentiment. But you can see on the right, over the last couple of weeks, the Delta variant, as the Delta variant has become dominant, has become more clear, we have seen a decline in consumer sentiment with Americans being more worried, more apprehensive. We haven't necessarily seen the material change, right? People reporting that they lost their job, that they have less income, but they are much more worried than they were even a few months ago. And we see that reflected in our pandemic adaptation continuum. This is essentially a series of questions where we ask people to get at their mind state, their sort of, you know, their outlook on life, as it were. And we sort of break it down into sort of two dimensions: coping, which essentially, you know, you're muddling through, you're making do the best you can, and improving, you're sort of thriving, you have a positive outlook, you're doing more. And we can see, again, that same pattern where coping, the more negative one, declined over the spring, improving climbed over the spring, until we got in late May, a point where the majority of Americans were in that sort of improving mindset. We're feeling optimistic, we're feeling good. That's when we sort of had that sort of moment in May and June where everyone felt like the pandemic was behind us. There's a lot of excitement, lots of, you know, hot, sexy COVID summer kind of references, those kind of fun things. But then Delta came out and this sort of ruined it. And we've seen a very quick return to that coping mindset, probably quicker than necessarily suggested by like the out-of-home behavior. And I think, again, this sort of speaks to people's exhaustion, their just sort of tiredness after a year and a half of the pandemic. And even if maybe the material risk isn't quite as high, people are just very, very tired. So then we have return to office, which is a big topic, and that has changed in the same pattern. So this is the perceived risk of working at an office, and we can see from August of last year to May of this year, and then through the rest of the spring, and then into now, people increasingly saw returning to the office as a small or no risk. And then over the last 2 or 3 months, the risk has sort of ticked back up. And I think that's why we're starting to see employers push off return to office plans, employers sort of speaking to, needing to continue to adapt because Americans continue to sort of see the pandemic as a bit of a risk and are adapting their behavior accordingly, even if not necessarily to the extent we saw last year during the first, second, and third waves. All right, so that is the data we have. So now if you have any questions, I certainly encourage you to use the Q&A field to submit questions. Scott, Wendy, and I are happy to answer them to the best of our abilities. All right, so let's see. First question, how long do you think the current rise in cases will persist? Scott, is that something that the healthcare team might have a perspective on?
Sure. I think based on the data that we're seeing, we think the current rise will probably persist until October or November. That's been kind of the trajectory that we've seen, depending on just people being outdoors, people coming together. I think with the start of the school year and more kids being together, I think we'll start to kind of see cases over the next few weeks, and hopefully, knock on wood, it will wind back down by the time we get to November, December, kind of like what we saw last year.
Great. Next question. What do you think the impact on consumer behavior of vaccine mandates from employers and governments will be? Wendy, Scott, who wants to take that off first?
I'll jump in, but I'd love to hear Scott's point of view as well. As we've seen from data that Chris presented, Americans certainly acknowledge the right of businesses to mandate vaccines of their customers. And it's about 2/3 of American adults that believe that businesses like restaurants certainly have the right to do that. And that's about the proportion of adult Americans that are vaccinated right now. So that's not a surprise. It is, from the data I've seen though, it's still highly politicized. So Republicans and Democrats still differ on that. So if you're a business and you're in an area that is profiles for a sentiment that's opposite of that, then be aware and adjust accordingly. But from the most part, from a total U.S. perspective, I'd say that most Americans would follow vaccine mandates and respect the businesses that are requiring them. Scott, anything on that you want to add?
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said, and I would just add to that I think we're seeing from an employment side, we're seeing that it is a job seekers market right now. And so I think if employers are mandating vaccines, I think you might start to see people shift what they're doing as far as employment goes if they really have a problem. But otherwise, I think I completely agree with what you said, Wendy.
Yeah, it's interesting in the data I've seen from Chris's team, actually, polling data, it seems like Americans don't want companies to fire employees for not getting vaccinated, yet they're in favor of, businesses having the right to do that. I think what's underneath that is they just want people to get vaccinated. So I think that's, I think it seems contradictory, but they don't want to hear about companies firing employees. But at the same time, they want people to be safe.
Great.
Here's a question. Can you remind us of the percent of vaccinated on the fence hard pass? I'll answer that one. So in our Axios tracking data, this is among adults, right? So exclude people under the age of 18. 72% about are vaccinated, leaving 28% unvaccinated. Of that 28%, they're roughly half and half in that sort of on the fence, maybe potentially could be convinced, and sort of hard pass, about 15% hard pass, 13% or so, maybe possibly on the fence. Though again, those numbers have been bouncing around a little bit, but I think it's best just to sort of think of that sort of 28% unvaccinated as sort of 50-50. That's the easiest way to sort of keep it in mind of hard no versus maybe. Next question. I think this is, Scott, something for you. What will the impact of the FDA approval of the Pfizer vaccine that I referenced yesterday be on hesitancy or vaccination rates?
That's a great question, something I think we're all interested in. I think, Chris just mentioned again what the kind of the hard pass versus on the fence. I don't think that will move any of the hard pass people. On the fence, I don't know that everyone on the fence was kind of waiting for the FDA approval to kind of say it's safe. I think we've certainly heard anecdotally, we've seen in data, people telling us, it's not officially approved yet. I don't know that I believe it's fully safe. So I think we should see an uptake but probably small. I think if it's 50-50 in kind of that non-vaccinated sector, maybe half of them are on the fence, I would certainly say at least less than half, maybe more like a quarter of them might be swayed by this. But that's probably me being just really optimistic, wanting to see the percent of vaccinated people increase.
If I may actually ask I want to ask you a follow-up of that is, do we think that the Pfizer approval is going to actually open employers up to having the mandates more now that it's sort of official?
I think it certainly gives them more cover. I mean, the fact that it was under an emergency use authorization, people could certainly argue this isn't proven safe. It's not officially proved. The studies haven't been verified and validated yet. And I think this kind of takes the wind out of some of those sails, which we've heard people argue against vaccine mandates, period. So I do think it will kind of take some of that out of that argument. But at the same time, my personal belief is a lot of that argument was a straw person argument. So I'm not really sure that there wouldn't be a different argument to make in favor of that. But I think that's a very interesting question. I think employers might feel a little bit more like they have something official like an FDA approval and a label and a brand name to go by.
Next one, maybe Wendy. Who do consumers trust right now for information?
Well, that's been a good question over the past 18 months or so, and it's kind of timely. We just got data over the weekend, and thanks to our Omnibus team for keeping me up to speed on everything. And we're starting to ask about the holiday season. I know it seems far away, but we need to start thinking about that if we're businesses that cater to the winter holiday season. We asked people, because most people don't know what they're going to do for the holidays right now, but we asked people whose advice you'd be likely to listen to when it comes to in-person gatherings over the holidays. And 80% said friends and family first, so that's at the top. CDC is still well respected, about 75%, and about 70% said local government. So that was kind of the top tier. Then the next tier, President Biden at about 60% and news media at 55%, so less likely to follow advice from those sources. And then towards the bottom is Donald Trump at about 30%. But interestingly, about 60%, which I know overlaps with doesn't add up to 100%, but 60% said they really make their own decisions. And I think what that means is they'll listen to the advice of these sources, but they might not always follow it, and they'll make some personal deviations from that as we go. So that's the latest data I've seen. I don't know, Chris, if you've seen any other data.
No, that broadly matches what we've seen throughout the pandemic of people trust friends and family first, sort of local government officials / their personal physician sort of second, sort of more national public health figures sort of third, and then like basically all news and politicians are like a distant fourth.
Yeah.
And it depends on sort of who you ask and when you ask them, sort of what the rank ordering is of the news and politicians, but those top three are sort of always the top ones.
Yeah, and that gives us some leading indicators of what might happen over the holidays. So even though people might not know right now, if we can sort of follow the advice of those sources, we can kind of guess.
Yep, that's right. Next question, Scott, maybe you can answer this, or I have some data from it. Do you think people are ready to get to? People who've gotten the vaccine are going to want to get booster shots, or people are going to push back against having to get a third or second, depending on which one they got shot?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'd love to know what you think about this. I think most of the people who've been vaccinated would be willing to get a booster shot. I know I feel like I'm at the methadone clinic when I go to like the local drugstore, kind of seeing, can I get a little bit more? But I do think there are probably people who, either they're afraid of needles, they were really reluctant to get the vaccine and needed to do it for work or something like that, where there might be a proportion who don't want to have to do it again, who would really bristle at the thought of being kind of forced to kind of go through this again. So I think it wouldn't be everybody who's been vaccinated would be happy to sign up for a booster, but I think the vast majority would. I'd love to know what you've seen in the data, Chris, you've been collecting.
Yeah, so we last asked about this in sort of mid-July, so right as Delta was getting started. So it's not the most up to date, but even back then, among the vaccinated, 3/4 said that they would be likely to get a booster shot when it was available. So pretty large majority, and that's essentially means that's about half of the adult population that says that they're likely to get the booster shots when it becomes available. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if that number's climbed now since Delta has gotten so prevalent out in the world, and there is all the sort of uncertainty about exactly how effective the vaccines are against preventing the breakout infections. So I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see larger numbers of, hell, I probably put that in our next Axios survey actually, of vaccinated people looking for the booster shot. Now unvaccinated, no thank you. It's hard to get them the first shot, much less a third. But yeah, I think there may be a small group, Scott, like you said, that are reluctant to get that third jab, but most are like you, lining up for their next hit. Here's a question, Wendy, maybe you can weigh in on. So what do you think about this whole idea of the roaring 20s that we were supposed to be about to be kicking into? Are they going to come back after we get past this wave, or did Delta kill them?
Delta's killed it for the moment. We thought I thought by fall, 75% of Americans would be heading into kind of a new normal, and that pent-up demand would kick in, and then we'd see celebrations, and that we'd celebrate big, and it's not happening. Delta has sort of squashed that feeling for the moment. There has been some pent-up demand. For instance, we know that U.S. spending in restaurants in July was pretty strong versus June, while other areas of spending decline, but because of the increase in caution that Delta has created, we see that, as Chris mentioned, that at-home behavior is increasing and away-from-home behavior is starting to decrease. And I think people are going back to they are actually yearning for roaring 20s right now. They're just yearning to keep seeing people in person. So they're hoping that in-person learning, seeing people over the holidays, being able to be with family and friends, being able to dine at a restaurant, that's where hope is right now. But no, roaring 20s is kind of far away.
Next question. Who is to blame for the rise in Delta? I can take that sort of. I'm not speaking from an epidemiological sort of standpoint, who's to blame, but I have data about who Americans blame, which is, I think, just as good. So we asked people, who do you think is responsible for the current outbreak? And among people who are vaccinated, it's the unvaccinated. Hands down, the vaccinated say the unvaccinated are the ones responsible for this current outbreak, like with a little bit of like side helping of like politicians, particularly conservative politicians and media. But, 80% say it's the unvaccinated. Among the unvaccinated, it's everybody else, but not the unvaccinated. It's the media, it's politicians, it's immigrants, it's public health officials, but not the unvaccinated. It is not their fault that the pandemic is continuing in their own minds. The truth, I won't speak to the truth. I think public health officials probably better suited for that, but that's sort of where the public lines up right now. The majority of Americans who are vaccinated are thinking it's the unvaccinated. The 28-30% who are unvaccinated are like, well, it's not us, it's everyone else. So here's a question, Wendy, that maybe another one for you. Is Delta going to give another boost to those sectors of the economy that benefited during the pandemic, like food delivery, online shopping, all that kind of stuff?
Food delivery, online shopping, streaming, video gaming, cooking. Yes, so obviously those at-home sectors did, grow dramatically during the lockdown period, the peak pandemic. We don't expect that level of activity corresponding to the peak levels of the pandemic unless we go through another round of shutdowns and shelter-in-place orders, which we don't expect that to happen. So, but we are seeing that, as I mentioned in a previous question, that away from home, time spent away from home is ticking down a little bit. So time spent at home is ticking up. And I think that the level of caution increases that we've seen with Delta variant are going to continue to have us inch down for the near term. And we saw that half of Americans are hesitant to go out and go to restaurants and concerts and crowded places. So I think it's true that we're going to see continued upticks in the at-home sectors. But as long as schools stay open, as long as businesses stay open, and as long as we don't see sheltering in place, we still see them not reaching the levels they did during the pandemic.
I think it's sort of a related question, Scott. What is the long-term impact on the healthcare system, or hospitals in particular, be, and how long might they be scarred by the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly within the healthcare system broader, we think there will be some changes that will be longer term. Definitely, telemedicine, telehealth is something that we've all had experience with now over the past year. And I do think the data suggests that will be here to stay. Probably not to the same level that it was during the peak of the pandemic, but certainly there are certainly ways that can ease the overall healthcare system, provide increased access to some patients for like routine visits and checkups. Within hospital, I think we will see a longer term impact. One of the things that we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, a lot of private healthcare systems, like hospital networks, are mandating vaccines, which I don't think those have kicked in yet. But the folks who are kind of dug in against includes a lot of healthcare workers. We see a lot of people, across every industry. And so I think there will be, if and when hospital networks mandate vaccines, I think you will see some people leave employment there, which unfortunately in the short term would likely exacerbate the staffing challenges at hospitals, especially on those who are left behind. But on a more positive note, I do think that the healthcare system, in particular hospitals, will use this as an opportunity to kind of address some situations going forward, namely capacity and managing capacity, and also addressing issues of burnout. I think there will have to be some pretty much industry-wide considerations around what we expect of our healthcare workers, especially those on the front line, those working in emergency departments, working in ICUs, working in hospital, both doctors, nurses, support staff, and kind of how we can make sure that they're well supported and best equipped to deal with this kind of situation going forward.
Great, thank you, Scott. Republican versus Democrat political affiliation data is interesting. Are there any trends towards convergence or divergence between them? What about independents? I can probably answer this a little bit. It depends on the domain you're talking about. I think it's good to sort of not necessarily think of these groups as monolithic single blocks. So among Democrats, there is, generally speaking, a pretty large majority that are in favor of vaccines, in favor of masks, in favor of mask mandates, vaccine mandates, sort of all of the things to prevent COVID. Large majority of Democrats are in favor of. A majority of independents as well, though not necessarily quite as large. Like Democrats, it's 80-90%. Among independents, it's more 60% maybe in favor. There's definitely sort of a little bit more division there. And then with Republicans, there's basically sort of two camps, and they're almost sort of equally sized, where there are Republicans who are sort of, yes, coronavirus is real. Yes, it is a threat. Yes, we should get vaccinated. I don't like masks. I don't like mask mandates, but if required, I will do it. And then there is, this is all fake. This is all fake news. This is all like a conspiracy of the deep state. Vaccines are bad, or microchips, or whatever other crazy conspiracy theory, and I'm not going to do any of it, right? So that's about half and half, though again, it depends on exactly what question you're asking. The numbers sort of can slide a little bit. That first half of Republicans has sort of generally sort of moved a little bit towards Democrats, again, sort of just more in terms of, yes, I'll wear a mask, or yes, I've gotten the vaccine. That other half, though, has continued to stay well away. And in fact, the fact that Democrats are in favor of these policies, I think this is my opinion, is sort of one of the reasons that they're against it, right? It's not even necessarily about the policy in and of itself. And again, it's to what I was saying earlier, it is about that cultural clash that we saw well before the pandemic started, and that we continue to see, that really underlines a lot of the animating factors of American life right now, of essentially sort of this, my team has to win, your team has to lose, zero-sum sort of mentality that just so happens to now have impacted sort of this major public health event. This is, I think, maybe an all ball. Looking ahead, what are you looking at to assess the long-term impact of the pandemic? What are you looking at to assess the long-term impact of the pandemic? Well, I'll answer a little bit, but I love to, Wendy and Scott, for you guys to jump in here. For me, I have been looking at a lot of those trust indicators, particularly sort of trust, not necessarily in political figures like Biden or Trump, but trust in some of the more institutional entities like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention or the FDA or state governments, American society is sort of in this sort of period where there isn't a whole lot of institutional trust. However, a certain measure of that is sort of required for society to continue functioning. At the start of the pandemic, we actually saw a relatively decent bump in trust in these sort of organizations, but it has continued to decline over the last years, decline certainly over the last couple of weeks as Delta has happened. And that's what I'm sort of looking at because, it does help influence the outcome of, is this the kind of moment in a couple of years that we look back and say, you know what, like maybe there were issues, but America was able to come through it in a positive fashion? Or is it a moment that we get through, maybe, hopefully, but look back in a few years and be like, wow, that was a disaster and we just totally mishandled it? And I think those trust indicators are sort of one of the key measures that I'm personally looking at to make sense of how that sort of impact is ultimately going to pan out over sort of the long term.
Yeah, that's interesting. We've done our own COVID segmentation of consumers, Americans. I hate to call them consumers because that pigeonholes people just into a role of buying stuff. But and I track how big the segments are, and the segments are kind of defined at a high level by two dimensions. One is concern about COVID and to the extent that it's affecting behaviors. And the other is financial strength. So the ability to withstand changes, disruptions, economic hardships. And so we've grouped people into those buckets, and their behaviors are sticky. And in some respects, there are some groups that no matter what the news is, they're gonna be cautious. There's some groups with a whole bunch of pent-up demand. There are some groups that have a lot of spending power, but have kind of reverted back into the home. So I'm tracking those groups, see how the size shifts over time to see what kind of stickiness we'll see in behaviors. So that's what I'm.
And I follow the data that Chris provides and all of his commentary.
Chris is our expert, actually.
I think the material, not to toot our own horn, but I think all of this data that Chris has shared today and that he continues to share is all really insightful and really helps me to understand the context when I'm talking to my clients about what's happening, what we think the future will hold. We have a lot of, I work with the pharma companies, and so a lot of our clients are wondering about, how does COVID impact, the broader healthcare market? How does the vaccine issue? How is that kind of creating trust or concern and hesitancy among treatments in general and other vaccines? And so I think I really look to the data that Chris provides and that our public affairs team provides. I think it's a really great way to track sentiment and what people are thinking and what's really driving and motivating different behaviors and different opinions.
Oh, thank you, Scott. That's very nice. It is actually
send me
really
$1
nice.
later.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna just send you that tip. It is really nice to work at an organization that does really believe as a core part of its mission is understanding society and sort of elevating sort of the voice of the people, and has given us the privilege to do a lot of this public facing work to really highlight how people are adapting in this crazy time. So I'm glad that it's getting used of use. Next question. This is a little bit of an interesting one. Any insight on the impact of the latest trends on pet ownership, acquisition, or abandonment? Pet ownership. I mean, maybe this is because of Cuomo, as he left his governor's mansion the other day, like leaving his dog behind, asking the staff if anyone wanted to take him, if people needed another reason to not like him. He just added that little cherry on top. We did actually do some poll questions a couple of months, 2 months ago maybe, asking about pet ownership. And most Americans have a pet. Interestingly enough, actually, cat ownership is slightly more popular with men than women. So the whole crazy cat lady thing is not, I mean, I'm sure it exists, but crazy cat dudes is just as possible. And while there are stories of people getting sort of their pandemic pets, that is a minority of all pets. It's a decent number of people, but a minority. And we also asked people if they had anxiety about having to go back to work and leaving their new fur babies at home. And some people admitted that they had some anxiety, but again, it was a minority of pet owners, something like 15%. But those numbers are all on the Ipsos website, so you could actually check them out if you wanted. I don't know, Wendy or Scott, if you guys have perspectives on pets.
No.
No comment on that.
I'm in favor of pets. I'm pro pet.
Pro pets.
I'm pro pet too, but no comment on
pets. Keep the door shut so that they don't join the webinar here. They do join us on our regular weekly podcast a lot, which is sometimes distracting. If you don't think another lockdown is coming, are we just going to see more mask mandates and occupancy limits and stuff like that for the foreseeable future?
Yes, I think so. The vaccine has changed things. So I don't think, and governments certainly don't want to shut things down. I mean, I'm here in California and we're usually the first to shut things down, or among the first at least. And I know there's no real appetite for that. So I think the effort is still to get people vaccinated, and if not, then to if people are standing firm, then to put policies in place that limit access to big groups of the unvaccinated. I know that most people are in favor of those kinds of mandates, that they believe that individuals, I think in the numbers I've seen maybe out of your group, Chris, that they believe that individuals have the right to decide whether to get vaccinated, but they don't have the same right to then participate in big group gatherings and activities. So I would assume that mandates, policies to kind of, and we've seen that masks work. So everybody's, not everybody, but the majority of Americans are in favor of mask mandates. So we're gonna just see a lot of that.
Yeah, I agree, and that's our data suggests that there's just not a lot of political will for wholesale shutdowns, even if it does exist for the masks and vaccine mandates that you just mentioned. This one is for Scott. How many cats do you have?
I do not have cats. I have birds, actually. I have a couple of quails, which is very, very odd. So I do not have fur babies. I know it's a very long story for another AMA webinar.
Yeah.
I can't bring myself to eat their eggs yet. It's they're in the refrigerator right now, and I can't bring myself to eat them because I know who laid them, and she's kind of mean. So I'm like,
wow,
that's fun.
That went to a dark place. So I apologize for that.
No worries. Same person though, real question. What's the, not real, both are real questions. I'm sorry. I don't mean to offend. What is going to be the lasting impact or use of all of the sort of virtual distance technology going to be? Like what's going to sort of stick around that we've adopted here? Telemedicine, distance learning, virtual events, all the rest of that.
I can start. I think telemedicine will be lasting. I don't think we've seen over the past year that a majority of patient interactions with doctors were virtual and over telemedicine. And I think going forward, insurance companies will crack down on that, and I think we'll start to see kind of forcing doctors to use platforms that are more secure than Zoom or FaceTime. And I think it will be limited to specific interactions that would be covered. But I think that's here to stay. I think from a general work standpoint, if we don't believe that people are going to be 100% back in the office, I think things like Zoom meetings will be here to stay, because I think you'll have a mix of people more in office, more remote than we've had before. And so I think, the camera, the whole Zoom setup, I think will be more of an expectation to have cameras on. That's just my opinion and perception. Would love to know what you both think.
Yeah, I'll answer it from, I think you mentioned distance learning, remote learning. I think the one parents are really frustrated with is the inability to let kids interact with other kids, and also they feel like the remote learning has set education for their kids back. So I don't think they want remote learning, but I do think it's a tool, and as people and parents and college kids, as they think about ways to learn, I think we've added it to our tool belt and are certainly willing and ready to do it where it makes sense and when it makes sense.
Yeah, and then I'll answer on sort of the business technology. I mean, I think all of the business technologies are going to be here to stay, because even before this current surge, when we asked Americans about their workplace, professional Americans about their workplace preference, most people want some sort of flexible work environment that allows them to be in the office a little, at home a little. And in that sort of environment, you have to have these sort of, Zoom, Teams, whatever, systems to do work. And I think most professional Americans have sort of adapted to it. So I think, there is certainly a preference to, for people to have some more in-person interaction. I think there's an appetite for that, as much for the socialization as like Wendy was talking about for kids. But the technology use, I think, is going to continue. I think the one thing that we still don't have great line of sight about is sort of the virtual meeting space. I know there's a lot of appetite to get back to real meeting type in person, like conferences and events. But I wouldn't be surprised if to an extent the virtual conferences and events actually continues too. But like, I think Zoom, get used to the Zoom meetings, because those are going to continue. All right, that is all the questions we have. Thank you for joining us all today. Ellen, you want to close us up?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much to Chris for the data and the insight, and Wendy and Scott for your perspectives. And we are still getting some comments about the quails. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think we got to all the questions, but if we didn't, we will respond by email. And also by email, you will receive a direct link to today's recorded presentation. Of course, before that and at any time, we welcome the opportunity to speak with you directly. So please reach out to us. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.